This audio production was made in collaboration with Audible Anarchist.
Chapter 2: Foxes Building Henhouses. Government Promises and Market Solutions. The Profitable Failings of Paris, the NGOs, and Climate Capitalism. Government responses to the ecological crisis are characterized by the compartmentalized single-issue approach that we have just seen is inadequate. Climate reductionism, reducing the ecological crisis to a simple and technocratic question of atmospheric carbon, makes perfect sense to governments, because if every aspect of the problem is governed by a different treaty or legal framework, they can minimize their efforts, focusing only on the issues prioritized by the media and wealthier constituents. Though warming and climate migration are part of the same issue, governments can make grandiose promises about reducing emissions even as they further militarize the borders responsible for so many deaths. Yet government responses have also been a catastrophic failing for the issues at the center of their reductionist approach. To get a sense for this, we first need to understand why it is such an unmitigated disaster that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change adopted the much-lauded Paris Agreement in 2016 and not, say, in 1978. Climate change is not a new idea. We have already seen how colonizers in the Americas from the 15th to the 19th centuries advocated deforestation in order to intentionally cause a change to regional climates. As for global climate change, that has been a concept for more than a century. In 1876, anarchist geographer Peter Kropotkin made a connection between industrial pollution and the melting of Siberian glaciers. 20 years later, the Swedish scientist Svante Arrhenius quantified the role carbon dioxide played in keeping the planet warm and suggested that the industrial burning of coal might produce a noticeable increase. In 1938, Guy Stewart Callender, a British engineer, published evidence that CO2 levels and temperatures had been rising over the prior 50 years. In 1959, scientists projected that atmospheric carbon would increase by 25% by the end of the century, causing major changes in the climate. President Johnson's Science Advisory Committee warned in 1965 that the burning of fossil fuels could create a runaway greenhouse effect. And in 1968, the Stanford Research Institute predicted the melting of the ice caps, the rise of sea levels, and a substantial increase in temperature that could likely affect global climate by the year 2000. Incidentally, Stanford carried out their report for the American Petroleum Institute. In 1967 and 1968, Exxon and Shell Oil, respectively, filed away internal reports that their activities were causing the air pollution that today is responsible for millions of yearly deaths. In 1969, NATO began studying climate change as a possible security threat. At this point, most climate scientists agreed on global warming, though there was not yet a consensus. A survey of scientific studies published between 1965 and 1979 found that 44 predicted global warming, while only 7 predicted cooling. Droughts in Africa, Ukraine, and India in the early 70s caused major food shortages and spread concerns about the possible effects of climate change. In 1978, the World Meteorological Organization announced their agreement with the greenhouse theory, and in the following years, further measurements and discoveries gave an increasingly convincing and complex picture of anthropogenic climate change. In 1988, hundreds of scientists gathered in Toronto and concluded that pollution caused by humans was already having, quote, harmful consequences in many parts of the world. They recommended a 20% reduction in emissions by 2005. That same year, the WMO and the UN formed the IPCC. In other words, we already had strong evidence in the 1950s that climate change caused by fossil fuels was a serious danger threatening the planet, and comprehensive studies in the 1960s showed that this view was probably correct. By the 70s, we can speak of a scientific consensus on climate change that was consolidated throughout the 80s. Nonetheless, it was not until 2001 that the consensus was finally announced to the world in a very public way, as 34 different national science academies and 2 important international scientific councils formally declared in favor of this view, as did the IPCC in its 3rd assessment report. From the moment when a strong majority of climate scientists were predicting dangerous global warming, including those funded by the petroleum industry, 20 years went by before the UN devoted significant attention to the problem. 33 years went by before the international scientific community announced their consensus in a highly public way, and 37 years went by before the first international treaty purportedly aiming to reduce greenhouse gas emissions went into effect. As for governmental treaties that have actually led to greenhouse gas reductions, we are still waiting more than 60 years later. The lag time, half a century between a strong scientific majority and some semblance of coordinated government action, shows how dependent our institutions are on the extractivist industries responsible for the ecological crisis. The media present an extreme case. In the 1970s, mainstream news articles about climate change abounded, but they were all warning people about global cooling, claiming that meteorologists couldn't keep up with all the new evidence. In the 80s and 90s, corporate media covered the topic with a blanket of silence as they shifted to a more subtle strategy of contention, treating both sides of the debate as equally valid, giving huge platforms to scientists in the pocket of the oil industry who claimed that global warming could be beneficial or that such changes were natural. Eventually, they shifted to delaying tactics, and the media and the fossil fuel lobby boosted the kind of naive environmentalism that put all the focus on individual consumer choices. Simultaneously, conservative media outlets accelerated their campaign of climate denial and deliberate misinformation, spreading ludicrous conspiracy theories about environmental activists somehow profiting off of their opposition to the multi-billion-dollar petroleum industry. The hypocrisy is staggering, considering that just 5 major oil and gas companies spend $200 million every year, quote, on lobbying designed to control, delay, or block binding climate-motivated policy, close quote. Capitalism in general has plenty of mechanisms to indirectly control a nominally free media and guide policy debates in democratic governments. Up until the end of 2006, 52 major news sources that were polled across the world only mentioned climate change a couple times a month. Media interest spiked in 2010, but between 2011 and 2015, climate change fell out of the news again, almost as low as the pre-2006 levels. In 2 weeks of hurricane coverage in the U.S. in 2017, 8 major TV networks mentioned climate change only 5% of the time. In other words, people were losing their homes and hundreds were dying, but on the whole, the media refused to educate people to the fact that climate change has been making hurricanes more frequent and more deadly. Quote, ABC and NBC both completely failed to bring up climate change during their news coverage of Harvey, a storm that caused the heaviest rainfall ever recorded in the continental U.S. Close quote. Longer form media also tends towards misinformation. In 2020, as I was beginning research for this book, not a single one of the top 10 titles on climate change recommended by Amazon was an evidence-based work about the dangers and possible solutions. On the contrary, what came up were industry-promoted bestsellers about how climate change was not such a big danger, or that protecting the economy was more important. The closest thing to a sensible perspective was a sort of self-help narrative on dealing with the anxiety we may feel about our dying planet. Inaction and prevarication on the part of government, media, and other private companies seem to be a case of the wealthy and powerful not taking the problem seriously. But that explanation does not fit the available evidence. Energy companies are both informed and sober as they study oil futures and decide whether to invest in fossil fuel infrastructure or alternative energies. Insurance companies are deadly serious when they calculate risks and losses from warming-aggravated disasters. And it was more than 60 years ago that Western governments first began studying climate change as a security threat. It only seems like leading institutions have not taken the crisis seriously because their response has been so thoroughly sociopathic. They have accelerated fossil fuel extraction, racing to achieve as much economic growth as possible before public opinion turns against them, and then insisting they sit at the head of the table when environmental protection finally becomes a serious policy issue, though the proposals they spin out are all designed to achieve even more economic growth, this time under a thin veneer of toxic green paint. At no point has it occurred to corporate and governmental leaders to empathize with the millions of humans who are dying, suffering needless diseases, hunger, and thirst, or to contemplate the tragedy of species and habitats that are disappearing forever. Within this historical framing, it also helps to see that the only thing that separates corporate bureaucracies from public bureaucracies is a revolving door. Whether key companies are state-owned, as in Norway, Indonesia, or China, or whether they are just subsidized by the state and entrusted with authoring regulations themselves, as in the US, the ruling class and the owning class are thoroughly enmeshed. One more piece is missing to understand the highly effective disaster constituted by the official solutions to the ecological crisis: the opposition. The NGOs that dominate the environmental movement are no less integrated into the capitalist industries destroying the planet than the most corrupt Republican or Tory official. At an increasing pace throughout the 90s, environmental NGOs shifted to a strategy of partnership with big business, increasingly accepting corporate donations and leasing out their logos to grace the products of Coca-Cola, Clorox, British Petroleum, Shell Oil, Unilever, McDonald's, Boeing, Monsanto, Starbucks, Walmart, and IKEA to convince consumers to keep shopping. Each of these companies has received the approval of and generously donated to NGOs like World Wildlife Fund, Sierra Club, the Nature Conservancy, the Environmental Defense Fund, and Conservation International. Even Greenpeace, one of the few that does not accept corporate donations, lends extremely destructive corporations like Unilever its good reputation through partnerships. The relationship between NGOs and corporations has become so tight, many share board members, like BP and the WWF. The Sierra Club accepted over $27 million in donations from the gas industry between 2007 and 2010, while the Nature Conservancy has accepted millions for the ludicrous project of helping BP carry out sustainable oil extraction. There are small NGOs that are effective at providing resources to those with immediate needs of survival. Those that operate boats rescuing migrants from drowning in the Mediterranean come to mind. But to avoid the age-old dynamic that sees little fish turn into big fish, the entire context needs to be radically shifted. Grassroots movements are resourceful, but there is no doubt that we need more resources on the ground. However, it is never worth it if we have to give up our autonomy and our revolutionary horizons to achieve those resources. And selling out is a major industry. Social critics have already drawn attention to the, quote, nonprofit industrial complex, close quote. The higher the stakes are with climate change and the ecological crisis, the greater the institutional pressure to sell out, and the greater the reward. Greenwashing pays off. The CEO of the Wildlife Conservation Society was paid $1,636,145 in 2019, while the CEO of the World Wildlife Fund was paid $1,455,444, putting them high on the list of highest paid charity CEOs, especially when one considers how many of the other charities on the list are connected to the profitable medicine, research, and real estate industries. These salaries, already crass profiteering off the dire situation of life on this planet, become even more shocking when we see how they have evolved. 10 years earlier, in 2009, the CEO of the U.S. branch of the WWF was paid $455,147. What caused his salary to triple? Did the big NGOs suddenly get more effective at forcing governments and business partners to protect the environment? On the contrary, the last 2 decades have been a solid streak of missed targets and broken promises, from biodiversity to carbon emissions and more. What are these unjustifiable pay raises reminiscent of? The financial bosses who also saw their salaries skyrocket, even as the monetary system they supposedly safeguard tumbled into recession, leaving the rest of us battling unemployment, evictions, and pay cuts. There should be no mistake. The NGO elite are a part of the mercenary apparatus that is selling the planet piece by piece. Now that the stage is set, we can watch the performance. The Paris Agreement and the Kyoto Protocol before it seem to be little more than publicity stunts. Even as the 2005 Kyoto Protocol was touted as a success, global emissions rose by 32% from 1990 to 2010. The Paris Agreement, with 189 signatories since it was launched in 2015, sets a goal of limiting climate change to 2 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. It is hard to know whether to criticize Paris for its illusory goals or its insubstantial methods. The agreement does not include firm commitments and enforcement mechanisms, and a mission reflected in the unfortunate fact that not a single major industrialized member has met its emission targets. Yet even if all these governments started keeping their promises, and that's a big if, 2 degrees of change comes with a fairly high possibility of triggering several interconnected tipping points and moving to a hothouse planet. According to a 2018 study, quote, "We note that the Earth has never in its history had a quasi-stable state that is around 2 degrees centigrade warmer than the pre-industrial, and suggest that there is substantial risk that the system itself will want to continue warming because of all of these other processes, even if we stop emissions." Close quote. Specifically, the agreement seeks to stabilize atmospheric CO2 at 450 parts per million. Never mind that this comes with a 26 to 78% risk of pushing well past 2 degrees centigrade of warming. Acceptable odds for world leaders. Many economists are happy, though. Their cost-benefit analyses suggest that a 3 degree centigrade temperature rise would be ideal. We can only imagine the low monetary value they place on the lives of the tens of millions of people who are dying and all the species that are going extinct. Has Paris made it clear that a new green economy is on the way? The world's banks don't think so. Since 2015, the 60 largest banks have financed fossil fuel companies to the tune of $3.8 trillion, and the loans are only increasing in quantity. The planet's governments are on the same page. Collectively, they provide $500 billion in subsidies to the fossil fuel industry every year. These are the governments we are entrusting with the solution to the problem. It is no wonder that a Shell oil executive was caught boasting about how they helped write the Paris Agreement, particularly the sections that allow for carbon trading. As Laura Tozani writes, quote, "Net zero emissions is not zero emissions." In practice, net zero usually means wealthy countries passing the responsibility for their emissions onto poorer countries through creative accounting. When we pare down the ecological crisis to the demands of climate reductionism, talking about capitalism is dismissed as off-message. Should it be any surprise, then, that climate policy has just become a new scam, allowing the wealthy to make even more money? It's worse than mere profiteering, as a social war analysis would lead us to suspect. Carbon trading creates a market for major land grabs across the global south, a final nail in the coffin of the world's peasants, and a continuation of the colonial dynamics that export the costs of the ecological crisis to poorer countries. It is also a key part of, quote, payment for ecosystem services, a way of, quote, quantifying and constructing the natural environment as a service provider commensurable with financial markets, which in turn constitutes a pillar of, quote, property-based counterinsurgency, the pernicious and often brutal repression of movements to defend the land. Placing our trust in Paris is an extremely precarious proposition. As democracy unravels, fewer and fewer governments are following a consistent course in policy. The worse the crisis gets, the better the electoral calculus of right-wing populism and economic nationalism that can lead to 180-degree shifts in policy. This is a major strategic liability for the mainstream climate movement, as seen in the US and Canada withdrawing from their climate commitments, Modi in India encouraging coal mining and canceling the ban on single-use plastics, or Bolsonaro in Brazil pillaging the Amazon for increased political and economic capital. The more power they have, the less governments need to listen to us. Even governments that maintain their Paris commitments are making a cavalier calculation, hoping to ease the transition and meet their emissions reductions at the last possible moment. But what happens when you have disasters like the 2019 Australian wildfires that released a quantity of carbon dioxide equal to half the country's annual emissions? Or the simultaneous massive die-offs in Australian mangroves and Tasmanian seagrass forests, each of them more important carbon sinks than the dryland forests. Such catastrophes will become increasingly common, and they make a mockery of the pretensions of governments to be in control. Emissions reduction targets are calculated to let capitalist economies squeak by, making the minimum change necessary at the last moment possible. They represent a climate brinksmanship that will ineluctably send us tumbling over the edge. On a technological as well as a policy level, the instruments for reducing global warming are a part of the problem rather than the solution. Because emissions reductions are designed to enable the continuous economic growth on which capitalism is predicated, going green means more than anything else a shift from fossil fuel energy to renewable energy on a massive industrialized scale. But renewable energies on an industrial scale are also extremely destructive. Hydroelectric power is currently the foremost renewable energy source. Hydroelectric dams are extremely destructive to build. They require a huge amount of concrete, production of which is one of the main greenhouse gas emitters. They cause the loss of huge amounts of forest and farmland. They kill off riverine species such as salmon. They disrupt natural flooding cycles necessary to many ecosystems, and their reservoirs emit large quantities of methane. Photovoltaic cells capturing solar energy, solar panels, frequently use toxic heavy metals such as cadmium, gallium, and lead in their construction. On a localized scale, houses in most climates could be heated, cooled, and provided with warm water through efficient design capturing solar energy. And if people were willing and able to alter their daily habits and limit their electricity usage, photovoltaics free of heavy metals could play a role in this. Many of the problems arise when we take the current energy economy and assume we can keep on operating in the same way, but with different inputs. To meet current energy usage, huge swaths of land would need to be appropriated, denuded, and fenced off for solar farms. And since photovoltaics are only productive during sunlight hours, we would have to construct an enormous infrastructure for energy storage and global high-voltage direct current power lines, meaning more toxic mining, more land grabbing, more energy expenditures, and more cancer and other illnesses. Solar panels also present a waste problem, as the typical panel only lasts 25 years. At current growth rates, by 2050 we could have 78 million metric tons of junk panels, and there is currently no good way to recycle them at an industrial scale. Andrea Brock and other researchers argue that far from a, quote, paradigmatic break, solar energy is merely the latest iteration of an industrial growth model, close quote, characterized by, quote, undemocratic and unsustainable industrial processes, the concentration of corporate power and profits, and externalized waste and pollution, close quote. Geothermal energy, aside from having a low efficiency, requires extensive drilling that can contaminate groundwater. The technology uses pentane, a highly toxic, flammable liquid. Geothermal plants release small amounts of methane and the toxic gas hydrogen sulfide, which causes acid rain. In accidents, geothermal plants can release large amounts, such as occurred in a single Hawaii geothermal plant during a drilling blowout in 1991, in 2013 after an equipment malfunction, and later in 2018 when the plant was damaged by a volcanic eruption. Nuclear power is not a renewable energy, given that it expends its fuel source, uranium, though there is a huge lobby seeking to promote it. Countries began adopting nuclear energy in the first place, not for its energy benefits, but because it advanced their nuclear weapons programs. Nuclear plants come with a constant risk of meltdown, releasing large amounts of deadly radiation into the atmosphere, and potentially making the territory uninhabitable for millennia. In the West, pop cultural representations of the Chernobyl meltdown ascribe the disaster to Soviet incompetence, but meltdowns and near meltdowns at Fukushima, Japan, 3 Mile Island, United States, and Loire-et-Cher, France, shine a light on Cold War propaganda and show that no regime is immune to disaster. In fact, over 100 nuclear accidents have occurred since 1952, the largest share of them in the US. But the daily effective operation of a nuclear power plant may be even worse than a meltdown. In 2011, 75% of US nuclear power sites were found to be leaking radioactive tritium. Depleted plutonium rods have a half-life of 24,000 years, which, for reference, is far longer than agriculture or wheels have existed, more than 40 times longer than the longest lasting state survived, and roughly 500 to 1,000 times longer than your typical nuclear storage site goes without experiencing a major leak. Nuclear proponents argue that the rods constitute a small volume of toxic material compared to mine tailing from coal production, for example. They tend to leave out the millions of tons of radioactive uranium mine tailings, 11 million tons from a single site in Utah, and the 1.2 million metric tons of depleted uranium produced by uranium enrichment. This radioactive byproduct has a half-life of 4,400 million years, or roughly the current age of the Earth. Inexcusably, those who developed nuclear technology invented no way to safely store all that waste for the amount of time it will pose a lethal danger to all life. And no such storage technology is even on the horizon. Many nuclear waste storage facilities have been found to leak radioactive compounds into the environment. Wind power is the second most widely used source of renewable energy. To be able to fully appreciate the kind of damage wreaked by green energy on an industrial scale, we can turn to research detailing the consequences of industrial wind farms in Oaxaca, Mexico. La Ventosa was one of the first towns in Oaxaca to be impacted by wind turbine construction, and is now more than 80% surrounded by giant turbines. Turbines were largely constructed on farmland bought up from farmers facing dwindling returns in agriculture. In other words, a precondition for the land grab was forcing local residents from a subsistence economy in which communities fed themselves and preserved indigenous practices of commoning into a global monetary economy that systematically drives farmers out of business. The combined impact of economic liberalization, like NAFTA, and, quote, climate change legislation that promoted foreign direct investment, FDI, in Mexico, close quote, led to a boom in wind turbine development. Additionally, the system of caciques and coyotes was vital to organizing land acquisition on the ground, with all the attendant corruption, fraud, and threats of violence. Overall, it was an involuntary process, with the state building high-tension power lines and other infrastructure in residential areas without even consulting residents. Quote, "The people are never fully informed unless they find out, and if need be, stop it for themselves. Otherwise, development happens." Close quote. Turbine construction damages soil, depletes groundwater, causes erosion and flooding, contributes to deforestation, and the turbines themselves kill off both terrestrial animals and birds, and frequently leak oil, contaminating the soil and drinking water. Local farmers have reported their cattle dying off or no longer producing, and residents who live closest to the turbines report, quote, "headaches, dizziness, digestive problems, vomiting, nosebleeds, exhaustion, and insomnia," close quote, possibly due to the noise pollution and vibrations caused by the turbines, as well as fumes from the leaking oil. Most jobs connected to the wind turbines disappeared after construction was finished, and the best jobs were reserved for foreign experts. Similar to the man camps that spring up around fossil fuel extraction sites in North America, leading to a sharp rise in violence against Indigenous women, foreign experts working for the wind farms also embodied predatory practices toward local women, frequently marrying into local families to acquire land titles, shifting those titles to the wind industry, and then moving back to their real families in Spain or the United States, leaving abandoned women, children, and broken communities in their wake. Energy produced by the wind farms in Oaxaca goes to major companies like Walmart, cement producer Cemex, and major food processing and mineral extraction companies, thus allowing some of the most destructive industries and consumer lifestyles to appropriate the language of sustainability and paint themselves green. Their use of wind energy also allows these industries, quote, "new possibilities of receiving climate and clean technology funds and loans," close quote. In fact, the quote, La Mata and La Ventosa Wind Park became the World Bank's leading clean technology fund, CTF, project in Mexico, close quote. Energy production is also being linked into, quote, "an energy export-oriented model that seeks to power industrial zones, private industry, and other countries," close quote, providing the electricity for the Maquiladora corridor, envisioned as part of the much criticized Plan Puebla-Panama that favors the U.S. consumer economy through environmental degradation and the exploitation of workers in sweatshops throughout Central America. Wind energy development in Oaxaca has further integrated locals into the global economy, but the results have been an influx of drugs, a much higher cost of living, rents skyrocketing by up to a factor of 10, and ironically, more expensive electricity. Most residents reported no social benefit from the development and bitterly recalled the promises made by major corporations like Iberdrola that resulted in little more than photo ops. The kind of development brought by the wind farms has also gone hand in hand with counterinsurgency interventions. For example, the, quote, "participatory mapping," close quote, of indigenous territory and resources in Oaxaca, organized and funded by the U.S. military with the aid of geographers from the University of Kansas. The mapping was officially carried out with a green capitalist logic, but its primary intention was to, quote, gather intelligence on emerging and asymmetric threats to the United States for the purpose of preparing for conflict, close quote. Ironically, one of these asymmetric threats blossomed and forced the cancellation of the mapping project when the people of Oaxaca rose up in 2006 and took control of most of the state, organizing in a horizontal way largely informed by indigenous traditions. Similar conflicts and ecological destruction connected to industrial wind farms have been documented in Scotland, Wales, Sweden, Spain, Greece, India, Kenya, Brazil, Chile, and the United States. Green energy is often used to give extremely destructive corporations a better image, and also win them access to the subsidies that are the main weapon of climate change legislation, from Paris Agreement targets to the Green New Deal. Renewable energies are often directly linked to fossil fuels. Germany is destroying the ancient Hambacher and Dannenröder forests in order to mine lignite, the dirtiest form of coal, in some of the deepest open-pit mines in the world. Yet they tout their use of green energy to run pumps and other infrastructure at the coal mines, and they have recently announced they will turn one old coal mine into a giant hydropower battery for storing excess solar and wind energy. Justin Trudeau, the progressive Prime Minister of Canada, entered office with promises to respect treaty rights and improve relations with Indigenous peoples. But the central push of his administration has been to deforest and eviscerate the center of the country with highly contaminating tar sands extraction and enforce the construction of oil pipelines through unceded Indigenous territory. Trudeau tried to improve his image by promising that the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, slated to pump 890,000 barrels of oil a day through highly sensitive ecologies, would come with tax money that would be dedicated to green energies. Green energy is also used as a justification for unregulated, ruinous mining on the seafloor, with the argument that the destruction of the very foundation of the marine ecosystem will produce the minerals necessary for batteries and other renewable energy infrastructure. Meanwhile, renewables are being used to justify the privatization of energy in South Africa. The green economy is fully integrated with the regular economy in other ways as well. Tech companies from Microsoft to Tesla like to style themselves as leaders in the climate crisis, the ones who will come up with the innovative solutions, a completely new kind of capitalist when compared with the dinosaurs of Exxon or Ford. However, there is no such thing as clean money. Big data depends on fossil fuel companies for a huge chunk of their profits. Cloud computing, led by Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, depends on billions of dollars in revenue from the major oil companies, which in turn depend on AI in order to increase the output of their wells, thus fueling more global warming. And all such companies rely on the capital provided by investors, who make that capital doing whatever turns a profit, no matter how destructive that activity is. Capitalism is, by definition, an amoral system. That is why, for as long as capitalism has existed, no economic practice, no matter how repugnant, from slavery to the manufacture of weapons of mass destruction to the distribution of addictive substances, has ever been effectively prohibited. One key to maintaining a consumer economy and the lifestyles taken for granted in wealthy countries is a switch to electric cars. Media and manufacturers conspire to label these as zero-emissions vehicles, which is a convenient inaccuracy. Electric vehicles simply switch the point of emissions to the power grid, If that grid runs on coal, electric vehicles also run on coal. And the drive to produce hundreds of millions of electric cars over the next few decades, while a major boon for the auto industry, is a huge strain on the environment, constituting an immense draw on energy needs and more greenhouse gas emissions. Then there is the question of the lithium, nickel, manganese, and cobalt mining necessary for the massive batteries. Nickel mining, carried out primarily in New Caledonia, Australia, Canada, Indonesia, Russia, and the Philippines, creates mountains of toxic slag. Refinement pumps millions of tons of poisonous sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. Manganese is mostly produced in open-pit mines in South Africa. Exposure during mining and processing can lead to neurological disorders. Cobalt mining, mostly carried out in the Democratic Republic of Congo, is responsible for widespread child labor, with more than 40,000 forced to work in the mines. Workers' deaths in hazardous conditions, genocidal acts against indigenous inhabitants, health problems among neighboring communities that range from birth defects and breathing difficulties to death, deforestation, and habitat loss for threatened species. Meanwhile, the growing demand for lithium was connected to a far-right coup that temporarily ousted the government in Bolivia, with a toll of 33 people killed and hundreds injured. Bolivia has the world's largest lithium reserves, largely in protected areas. In response to criticism about a possible role, Elon Musk went on Twitter to blithely assert, quote, "We will coup whoever we want," close quote. Ousted President Evo Morales was industrializing lithium production and had already signed deals with French, Japanese, and Korean companies to devastate a part of the Uyuni salt flats. However, under Morales' plan, Bolivia would have retained a higher share of the profits. Lithium mining is experiencing a boom in northern Portugal, where open-pit excavations are used instead of harvesting brine. The result is deforestation, habitat destruction, noise and chemical pollution, and water depletion, not to mention gouging out the mountainsides. But because the lithium is going to batteries, EU environmental regulators are giving the mining their full support. Renewable energy and deceptive solutions like electric cars have a deleterious effect on the environment and on human health. They are being promoted in large part to placate the public with the message that those in charge are carrying out big changes, that the solution is already here, and as a means to funnel huge amounts of public funds to major corporations in a modern-day Marshall Plan to prop up a chronically sick economy. The placebo effect of green energy is evident in media reporting. After noting that 2017 broke all previous records for carbon emissions, a typical article calmed readers with some good news. Quote, "There have been some promising trends, like an increase in renewable energy, with jobs in that sector rising by 5.7% between 2016 and 2017, according to the report," close quote. In other words, there is good news and bad news. The bad news is our solution isn't working. The good news is more and more people are using it. The cognitive dissonance involved in these formulations is astounding. Aside from industrial-scale renewable energy, many experts talk about the need to create carbon sinks to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere as quickly as possible. A major study expanding on the IPCC's action proposals demonstrated that reforestation was the most important course of action to stop warming. In other words, planting billions of trees over the next few years. The problem is, When governments try to mandate such sweeping changes from above, the most marginalized elements in society, and also non-human life that is excluded from personhood, get crushed. Top-down reforestation efforts frequently result in land grabs that dispossess indigenous peoples and agricultural communities, and frequently benefit logging, tourism, and other major industries. They are also incapable of spreading actual forests, which are complex multi-generational habitats uniquely adapted to the local territory. So-called reforestation from above is designed by people who don't even understand the difference between a monocrop tree plantation and a thriving ecosystem with trees, nor do they have a financial or spiritual interest in learning that difference. Chile provides a key example of a neocolonial country with an extractivist economy. Its main sectors are copper mining and logging. On paper, Chile is listed as a heavily forested country, and it uses these supposed forests to economic gain in the form of carbon credits. In fact, the country has very few actual forests left. Much of the loss can be traced to when the brutal Pinochet dictatorship transferred huge swaths of Mapuche lands to the logging industry, which destroyed most of the remaining native forests and replaced them with monocrop plantations of non-native eucalyptus and pine. The plantations are killing the soil, lowering the water table, and depriving the Mapuche of the species they traditionally rely on for their food, ceremonies, and medicine. The environmentalist pretensions of logging companies and government ministers is contradicted by a key activity in the Mapuche struggle: chopping down trees in forestry plantations in order to replant native trees or to sow crops and achieve food sovereignty. Much indigenous territory is also threatened by ecotourism, another government corporate scheme for domesticating and exploiting the land that masquerades as a solution to the ecological crisis. Selling a destination as pristine in the Western imaginary requires expelling the local inhabitants or converting them into guides, cleaning staff, and other invisibilized sidekicks to the conscientious tourist. The low quality of jobs in the tourism sector and the need to attract wealthy customers from the global north reveal this as just another iteration of colonialism, and one fully integrated with the destructive airline and cruise industries. Economic recessions show how unsustainable the approach is. When we treat nature as a monetized resource, the shift from cameras back to chainsaws actually occurs quite quickly when the economy demands it. Even when the chainsaws can be kept at bay, the practice of conservation has generally meant roping off huge areas and evicting the human inhabitants. This is because the world's dominant institutions continue to hold an aporophobic, aristocratic view of nature that excludes humans, since for the wealthy, food and survival appear automatically their God-given entitlement. Nature is something external, distant. It can be set aside for specifically delineated upper-class enjoyments, whether hunting, sightseeing, or scientific research. They certainly don't contemplate humans as a necessary part of the ecosystem. It should be no surprise, then, that paramilitary park rangers, paid for by major environmental NGOs like the WWF, have been accused of genocidal practices and acts of violence against indigenous people in the Congo, Cameroon, Botswana, and elsewhere. This includes the WWF's expropriation of Baka lands in Central Africa, which are then commercialized with concessions to logging companies and trophy hunters, paired with violent attacks by paramilitary park rangers. There are also cases of ex-soldiers from the U.S. returning from neocolonial duties in Afghanistan and being recruited for the good cause of shooting alleged poachers in African forests, the prohibition of hunting by San peoples in the Kalahari Desert with the support of the British government, the execution of poor villagers gathering firewood in the Zambezi National Park, and the planting of high-powered weapons or elephant tusks next to executed indigenous hunters in order to portray them as highly paid poachers. And all this in a context in which lucrative trophy hunting by wealthy white people, from Eric and Donald Trump Jr. to the King of Spain, is part of the financial calculations of conservationism. Nor are such practices exclusive to Africa. Informants near Kaziranga National Park in India are paid $1,000 if they give a tip that leads to the killing of a poacher, leading to an industry that preys on those who continue a traditional relationship with the forests. The semi-nomadic Gujar of Kashmir follow their herds, staying in different homes in the summer and the winter. For countless generations, they have been stewards of the region's forests, yet it was the Wildlife Protection Department that began demolishing their homes. And in Oaxaca, Mexico, at the site of the previously mentioned industrial wind farms, paramilitaries working for the energy companies often work with the police to attack or detain so-called poachers in the areas deforested by the turbines. A UN Convention on Biodiversity plan to place 30% of the world's land area in conservation was the target of an open letter that took issue with how the plan, quote, continues the marginalization of rural people who will be most affected by its measures and ignores decades of research and experience on the social impacts of conservation, close quote. Even conservation programs designed to be feminist and decolonial, in opposition to the dominant trend of green militarization, tend to be severely limited in what they can achieve because, as documented by Laura Trezani in the case of an all-female anti-poaching unit in South Africa, quote, a fundamental change cannot be brought about and operate within existing unequal and unjust structures, close quote. Because all accumulation in a capitalist system accelerates further accumulation, the rollout of renewable energies is being accompanied by an increase in fossil fuels. A similar thing happened in the 80s when energy efficiency increased, encouraged in no small part by the consumerist environmental movement of the day. And due to capitalist price dynamics, total energy usage also increased. In other words, technological improvements touted as being good for the environment often have the opposite effect. Fossil fuel infrastructure constitutes a huge amount of fixed capital that fossil fuel companies are not going to walk away from, and they have a fair amount of leverage over production efficiency and price, spurred in part by green technologies like carbon capture, to make sure the economy keeps buying and burning. With carbon emissions not slowing down in time to avoid surpassing 2 degrees centigrade of warming, a large number of climate experts and entrepreneurial capitalists are turning to questions of geoengineering and carbon removal. In After Geoengineering, Holly Jean Buck provides a useful review of many of the methods being developed and the difficulties and limitations they entail. Since carbon capture is being sold as a way to buy more time, she poses the question, time for whom or for what? Are we buying more time for endangered species, threatened habitats, and vulnerable human populations? Or are we buying more time for the governments and companies to continue enriching themselves and to slowly wean themselves off of fossil fuels when it is convenient to their profit margins and geopolitical strategies? As she makes clear, quote, the polluters are first in line to benefit from carbon capture. Currently, the predominant strategy for carbon capture is through natural methods, namely reforestation, which comes with its own problems. But other strategies, many of them classified as geoengineering, are increasingly gaining attention and sometimes funding. Examples include injecting carbon pulled out of the atmosphere into cement or into bedrock, where it mineralizes, liquefying carbon and storing it in old gas and oil wells, constantly seeding the upper atmosphere with aerosols that will reflect sunlight, dusting agricultural soils with ground-up minerals that increase carbon retention, or running huge offshore plantations for genetically modified algae to be used as a fuel source. The main real usage of any of these technologies at the moment is by the fossil fuel industry injecting captured carbon into its wells to displace oil or gas and increase output, known as enhanced oil recovery. I agree that we need to consider all of these proposals, since it is a matter of stopping mass starvation and saving species from extinction, but only if we can do so fully aware of their true dimensions. First off, we need to consider the cane toad phenomenon, whereby interventionist technologies introduced to solve problems created by earlier interventions create even bigger problems. As Western colonial civilization fumblingly developed an interventionist mechanical understanding of ecology, in this case in Australia, they released the giant cane toad as a predator to control runaway populations of rabbits, an earlier colonial introduction. But the cane toads ended up eating everything, decimating many native populations. The truth is, at the intersection between knowledge and business that constitutes almost all of today's scientific practice, there is a solid tendency to pollute first and look into the health problems later, from plastics to PFOA to phthalates. If you dangle a dollar bill over a cliff, today's science-driven industries will jump and assume they can use their earnings to buy a parachute before they hit the bottom. A pertinent example of this phenomenon is how carbon capture at scale will require a massive infrastructure, including a huge network of pipelines for transporting carbon from its capture site to its storage site. The fossil fuel industry are the only players in the current context with the ability to build and profit from this infrastructure. And the reality is, all pipelines leak. From February 2019 to March 2021, there were around 320, quote, oil and gas-related incidents, close quote, oil spills, fires, blowouts, and gas releases, just in the northwestern corner of New Mexico, mostly on Navajo Nation land. One such incident was the leakage of 1,400 barrels of fracking slurry into the local watershed. Shall we now build more pipelines for the sake of the environment? This is yet another proposal sopping in climate reductionism, environmental racism, and coloniality. In the case of carbon pipelines, a leak would mean death by suffocation for all animal life forms nearby. Beyond cane toads, we need to consider the very question of what we consider to be technology. After all, the Amazon rainforest constitutes a massive technology resulting from thousands of years of intelligent and reciprocal influencing by hundreds of native peoples. Next to them, Carbon capture experts are amateurs. At this point, it becomes necessary to distinguish between two very different paradigms of technology. What we can call interventionist or engineered technology is a Trojan horse for beliefs of human supremacy and practices of extractivism, exploitation, and depersonification of the other against which the technology is deployed. Today, it is fully wrapped up in the legal regime of intellectual property and the institutional framework of the profit-oriented academy, laboratory, and research institute. It is a technology of enclosure, of the alienated worldview that looks down at our lives from above in order to impose a plan that necessarily divides governors and governed, designers and inert material. On the other hand, we have a popular or traditional technology which belongs to, is developed and passed down by a community, which is territorially specific, nuanced, and reciprocal, which constitutes a form of dialogue and commoning and therefore tends to be ecocentric, and which is necessarily anti-colonial. Half of any technology is deployment, how a specific artifact is integrated and mobilized throughout society in conjunction with other technologies and organizational techniques. Currently, interventionist technologies are deployed by a massive ecocidal infrastructure, and their use is controlled by corporations governed by the need to profit. The institutional paradigm reinforces technocratic quantitative thinking that is reductionist and blind to complex realities on the ground, putting well-meaning scientists in bed with entrepreneurs and economists, giving rise to figures like the carbon budget that normalize the extreme suffering and damage that are already widespread. To discuss bioenergy carbon capture and storage, BECCS, or rocks for crops in the current context, as though once we invent these marvelous things, we will be able to use them in a sensible manner, is to be completely oblivious of our surroundings. The extreme naivete of brilliant scientists should never be underestimated. It was, after all, pacifists who gave us nuclear weapons, particularly Einstein, Meitner, and Szilard. The infrastructural and cultural context, who holds power and how power is shaped and conceived, matters. The intentions of inventors and researchers do not. An acceleration of interventionist technologies will only accelerate the tendencies of power as it already exists. Already, technologies for controlling the weather are exacerbating pre-existing conflicts. Seeding clouds to capture rain or prevent it has pitted the owners of BMW factory lots in Mexico against local farmers and contributed to the militarized conflict between China and India, with the latter unable to compete with the scale of the Chinese program to harness ever-diminishing rainfall. As we will see in later interviews, the question of what we mean by technology, who controls it, and within what power relation, on what side of the social war it is deployed, are all more important than the technical specifics of one innovation or another. In the meantime, I would suggest that those who cannot even go on record opposing intellectual property cannot be trusted to understand the dimensions of this problem. Every technology that is not fully under our control, fully expropriated from the capitalist market and colonial institutions, is another weapon pointed at us and at the planet. Religions of consumption, ecocide, and entitlement. How mainstream media, politicians, and scientists speak about the ecological crisis, often reveals a backpack laden with Eurocentric colonialist myths. Quote, "In the beginning, human beings tended to view nature as a mortal enemy," close quote, according to an article in the New York Times. Their examples come from the Old Testament and European colonizers of the Americas. In other words, while arguing for a scientific view of climate change, they embrace a Western mythological view of human beings, one that even seems to give a nod to the biblical notion that we've only been around a few thousand years. Discourses around human nature are almost always attempts to erase the wrong kind of human and to justify the status quo. Western mythologies, for all their diversity and the breadth of their explanations, reach consensus on viewing humans as a superior life form, thus opening the door to hierarchies among humans between the more human and rational and the more chthonic or animalistic. In this consensus, nature is everything else, including and especially those humans who are not human enough. They all become resources to be exploited. In statist chronicles going back millennia, wild was generally a synonym for stateless, and thus also for communities that practiced some form of commoning in a more reciprocal relationship with other living beings. In early East Asian states, the metaphor frequently used was raw, again connoting a more natural condition, not having passed through technological improvements. In Genesis, God exhorts his followers to fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. Aristotle ranked all living beings on a ladder, with humans at the top, of course. His ladder construct has remained popular among Western philosophers and scientists from the right, left, and center for the past 2 millennia. Aristotle also believed the souls of women, children, and slaves were incomplete compared with the souls of Greek men. Cicero said that all things in this world which men employ have been created and provided for the sake of men. Descartes argued that vivisection gave one a mechanical understanding of other animals, and that once we understood them mechanically, there was no reason not to kill them. Mechanists, influenced by Descartes' insistence that other animals had neither reason nor a soul, promoted the idea that they did not experience emotion or suffering, a convenient idea for capitalism at that time, which was in full expansion and relying heavily on the labor power of beasts of burden and the first stirrings of industrialized meat production. This belief tended not to be shared by Descartes' lower-class contemporaries, yet it remained prominent among scientists through the 20th century. Inevitably, it was a belief and a practice that the foremost scientists among the slave-trading nations of Europe and in Nazi Germany applied to humans they considered to be less human. People brought up in Western society, and to a differing extent and in more complicated ways, people brought up colonized by Western societies or in societies that follow Western economic models, are taught that the world is our gold mine and our outhouse. Even attempts to respect non-human life that base themselves in Western philosophy tend to be anthropocentric. The result is often a piecemeal approach that extends protection to the beings most similar to humans and the most aesthetically pleasing. Plants and fungi are also capable of perception, learning, and making choices. They have their own stories, their own value. But why stop there? It has become clear that cultures that have traditionally viewed the soil or water as living things are effective at preserving them, while the culture that treats soil and water as inert resources has created a planetary catastrophe in which most fertile soil has been destroyed and huge swaths of the globe are facing water shortages. No healthy response to the catastrophe is possible without acknowledging that Western civilization is a failed civilization and that its notions should be interrogated in light of its consequences. Ideas of human superiority are not universal. Colonialism, again, is the culprit for silencing other views of our relation with the world. And it is largely from colonized peoples and struggles against colonialism that these other views are expressed. Vietnamese Buddhist monk and teacher Thich Nhat Hanh explains the connection between relations of empathy and knowledge that starkly contrasts with, for example, Descartes' practice of mechanism, apathy, exploitation, and objectivity. Quote, "When we want to understand something, we cannot just stand outside and observe it. We have to enter deeply into it and be one with it in order to really understand it," he says. Sulak Savarska, a Thai activist and teacher of engaged Buddhism, writes, "Even before the great traditions of Asia, animism contributed towards the cultural concepts of peace and social justice, encouraging respect for natural phenomena. We were taught to revere the spirits that look after the forests and oceans. At each meal, we expressed gratitude to the rice goddess to remind us not to eat wastefully and to be aware of all the human labor and natural resources that went into each plate of food. Traditional rites of the field also contributed to an awareness of and gratitude towards nature. Local festivals promoted communal spirit, reminding us that rice is for collective consumption rather than individual wealth." Nias Sambi, quote, "a prominent figure in the Samis' struggle for justice since the 1970s, close quote, against the occupation and exploitive assimilationist policies of the Norwegian, Swedish, Finnish, and Russian states, explains how. You can see the same pattern everywhere colonialism took hold. Traditional spirituality was the first element of the culture to be attacked. The land doesn't belong to us, we belong to the land, and it is our responsibility to take care of it. Practicing traditional spirituality is not only about healing and medicine, it is about understanding how everything is connected, about being able to relate to nature and be its guardian. Sami historian Age Solbach wrote, "Here in Sapmi, all of nature is alive. Everything has a soul, whether it is a birch or a rock, a lake or a creek." Mushkegowuk scholar Jacqueline Hoekema-Witt defines, quote, "the difference between the Cree concept of land ownership and the colonial concept of private property," close quote, as follows. "You cannot buy land and own it like you own a car. Yet we do own the land in a different sense. As much as we own the land, the other beings on the land, animals, plants, rocks, own the land as well, meaning that we were put on the land by the Creator, and everything on the land belongs there and can use the land." Métis and Cree writer Mike Goldhawk goes on to explain, "Land is the terrain upon which all our relations play out, and it can be even seen as a living thing itself, constantly shaping and being shaped by other life forms. Land isn't just a place, it's also a territory which implies political, legal, and cultural relationships of jurisdiction and care. Traditional Cree laws like Si Dos Gatoen, coming together in mutual support, and Mio Wichitoen, the intentional cultivation of good relations, stand in stark contrast to this settler system, which is based on private and individualized rights to property and political representation. Cowie Bahe and Brandon Benally explain the Diné concept of K, which anthropologists catalog as a kinship system. It is much more than that, says Bahe, a, quote, huge overlapping philosophy that the whole universe is interconnected. But it's also these relationships that we have with one another and with the elements that exist in the world, whether that be the weather or the water or the animals, close quote. Benally calls K our theory of everything. It's how we're connected to everything, but specifically how that kinship is reciprocated and maintained. Dr. Ku'ule Rogers, a Hawaiian coral reef ecologist, explains how the Kumulipo, the Hawaiian creation story, quote, talks about how the first two beings bring forth organisms in the order of importance. The first is the coral polyp, followed by the coral colony, then the marine creatures, then the terrestrials. The native Hawaiians understood that their connection to the sea was absolutely vital to their lives, close quote. Christian missionaries like Daniel Dole, whose family would go on to create the world's largest fruit canning company, came to Hawaii in the mid-19th century to destroy the indigenous belief in a spiritual connection with the sea and the earth, while also snatching up huge tracts of land for business ventures. Restoring the traditional relationship and the communal fishing practices that go along with it is vital to saving Hawaii's endangered marine ecosystem. Standing Rock Sioux scholar Vine Deloria, Jr., found that, quote, land acquisition and missionary work always went hand in hand in American history, close quote, and that, quote, exploitation by one's fellows became a religious exercise. Law became a trap for the unwary and a dangerous weapon in the hands of those who understood how to use it, close quote. By rejecting Western civilization, I am most specifically saying that we need to eradicate colonialism, which is really the inaugural event that created the pernicious concept of the West. We need to eradicate all the political and economic institutions that carried it out, and the philosophies that gave it an alibi, such as the nested ideas of human and European supremacy. I recognize that hardly any social structure or belief form on the planet has been untouched by colonialism, and that many of us, myself included, have been brought up completely within the matrix of structures, practices, and beliefs that make up the nebulous, fictive, and always poorly defined West. We can't just choose a new culture and a new history as though such things were items to be found in a supermarket. At least we cannot do so while fighting colonialism. I recognize that we are faced with a world of ruins, and that every community will have to sort through those ruins and decide which ones they treasure, which ones to throw on the bonfire, and which ones can be repurposed for a healthy world based on solidarity and reciprocity. At a minimum, this critique means recognizing and refuting the ideas that are hegemonic in present society, the ideologies we often do not recognize as such, and that all the dominant institutions reproduce. This includes capitalism, which has wormed its way into environmental movements with the concept of sustainable development. Despite numerous studies that continued economic growth and ecological sustainability are not compatible, that green growth is simply not possible, generations of pragmatic environmentalists and ecologically minded scientists have been duped into dedicating their efforts to the chimera of green growth. As argued by Demaria, Callas, and Backer, quote, growth is not only a material and economic process with social and ecological costs, but also a hegemonic idea that obscures more ecologically friendly and egalitarian alternatives. A critique of this failed civilization also extends to the dominant practices and institutions of science, and it is, to put it lightly, impolitic to criticize science at the current juncture because of the prominence of climate denialists willing to dismiss an overwhelming consensus regarding the ongoing ecocide that threatens us all. However, this is not a clash between irrational, superstitious people and people of science, as progressive media would have us to believe. In fact, the very trope of superstitious hordes is both racist and inaccurate, as the so-called tribal peoples evoked by the cliché, insofar as it ever referred to real people, were people who spoke about the dangers of destroying the environment long before scientists did. And their spiritual practices, the much maligned superstitions, were a key element of their intelligent, ecocentric forms of life. The sad fact is that science denialism is a fully scientific phenomenon, fed by the advanced algorithms of Facebook, the many scientists in the employ of the fossil fuel industry, and the richly financed studies on what kind of populist lies politicians can get away with. The problem with the Believe Science slogan is that it presents scientific research as a neutral, harmonious process. Critiquing science as it exists today, the web of institutions, funding, and employment opportunities, and research agendas inseparable from the cultural priorities and prejudices of those who design them, is not a rejection of empirical knowledge production or any conceivable iteration of scientific institutions that might exist in alternate universes. It is a way to unmask the mythology that presents science as a pure synonym for knowledge, and to talk about what is actually happening right now and what needs to happen. Ecocide is a highly technical process. Not a single one of the industries responsible for destroying our home has developed without the integral participation of academically trained experts. Not a single oil well, not a single gold mine, not a single fracking site. Scientists are shaped by the same mercenary pressures as all higher value laborers in a capitalist economy. The scientific academies and institutions that exist today generally arose or matured as part of the global process of colonialism. The Royal Society in the UK, the world's oldest scientific institution, was an active accomplice in the military and economic expansion of the British Empire. The most prestigious U.S. universities exist in large part to support and derive much of their funding from U.S. militarism. Disciplines from geology to anthropology arose as part of the colonial project, and within extractivist mining industries or counterinsurgency operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, they continue to play that role. Botany and chemistry, together with the pharmaceutical industry, simultaneously belittle and exploit indigenous knowledge of local plants and ecosystems. Kevin Chong, a Hawaiian activist with Kua'ina Ulu AUAMO, an organization that pressures the government to allow community stewardship of the land and waters, relates how, quote, conservation work was tied solely to a Western way of looking at biology and ecosystems. In the past, outside experts weren't connected to the communities they studied. It's forgotten that expertise exists in the community itself, close quote. Among the people I interviewed for this book, participants in ecological and anti-colonial struggles around the world, a distrust and hostility toward academics came up again and again, unprompted. They were frequently identified alongside NGO workers, celebrity activists, and politicians as those who exploit and even help destroy social movements in line with the interests of those who fund their institutions. Communities in resistance could make great use of the resources academics have to offer, and in some examples we'll look at in Chapter 3, they already are. For this to be possible, academics need to learn how to listen to the land, to communities, to people in struggle. Whether this changes comes down to an important question of positionality. Where will they locate themselves in relation to the powerful institutions of knowledge production that molded them, and the communities those institutions seek to extract knowledge from? Will they come to communities in struggle as saboteurs and thieves, ready to dynamite the enclosures their bosses have built around common knowledge, stealing from their institutions and giving back to the community, helping knowledge and learning become collective properties again? Or will they come as they were designed to, like factories or transatlantic ships, bearing false promises of progress, plundering and disciplining, hoarding the benefits and externalizing the costs? Simply put, it's up to them. However, we cannot wait for them any longer. The experts who caused the problem are not going to solve it, certainly not without acknowledging their extensive institutional power and clearly positioning themselves on the sides of communities in struggle and against their funders, against their own careers. In the meantime, people are doing all they can to collectivize knowledge. This also means recognizing and harmonizing two different kinds: knowledge that is quantitative, falsifiable, and universal, and knowledge that is situated, corporeal, historical, and self-aware. To place this critique within a living history of resistance, I spoke with Adriana Cuena. Adriana has participated in the food and agricultural resistance movements in Venezuela of the past 2 decades, quote, which in turn are heirs, of course, of much longer historical processes of struggle for the land and sovereignty in Venezuela, close quote. She has been a part of collectives and platforms like La Campaña Venezuela Libre de Transgénicos, Campaign for a Venezuela Free of Transgenics, and El Movimiento Popular Semillas del Pueblo, Popular Movement Seeds of the People. More recently, she has migrated to Barcelona, where she takes part in the urban garden Queerhort and La Cuina, quote, an artistic laboratory working on food and politics, close quote. She writes, I believe history has shown us enough times that formal or academic science is not neutral. It is configured in such a way that the knowledge produced in turn reproduces colonial and patriarchal logics that expand the domination of the scientific institution it represents. It is a Eurocentric institution that dances to the tune of capital. There are exceptions, but I believe technocratic propaganda already gives them plenty of coverage, and we try to speak from a different place. Does that mean that knowledge and consciousness are affairs of the powerful? No, and no. It means that in the notion of the expert, There is always a latent racism, a latent authoritarianism that is quite dangerous, that legitimates itself as something superior, that underestimates and or commodifies popular scientific knowledge, as well as the people who produced it and those who have tended to it, as a network and across many generations. If what we need to survive on this planet is to repair our ecosystemic relations, and we understand that the academy, the universities, the research centers are colonial institutions, and we also understand that colonization is at its base an ecological problem, with its criminal logic of accumulation by dispossession, and that the problem is differentiated between the North and the South, between the city and the countryside. I think it is worth stopping to think what kinds of questions can be posed from within that academic, scientific institution. And we should also ask, or at least doubt, how is it that the knowledge that arises exclusively from these institutions is more useful or more legitimate than the knowledge produced by people in their own territories that have been wrapped up in absolute devastation, but also intense climate resistance for years now? I think that the scientific approximation to knowledge damages territories as well as the comprehension of the world that is possible, because it is too fragmented and because it homogenizes, tries to standardize solutions, and in doing so, it loses and sometimes annihilates the adaptive and sustainable knowledge that has made human life possible on this planet for thousands of years. As a semi-urban, white passing granddaughter of displaced peasants, I could feel how my path through the academy offered me, basically, the construction of a supremacist subjectivity with important degrees of self-hatred that did not allow me to even formulate coherent questions regarding the history of despoliation of our territories in Venezuela, nor to understand the needs and desires that beat in our hearts as a result of this history, of these resistances. The mere attempt to formulate these questions was considered subversion, and as a result, persecuted. Once I had already learned this, I decided to study for real, and I shifted my gaze toward peasant and indigenous knowledge, and I realized that 1, I am completely ignorant, and 2, the true science, which is to say observation, experimentation, innovation, and the transmission of popular knowledge and technology in Latin America, and particularly in Venezuela, has resisted 100 years of modern petroleum-linked destruction and 500 years of colonial devastation. As I learned, listening, caring, and letting myself be cared for, sewing, navigating, singing, and cooking, I witnessed the arrival of technicians and experts of every type: engineers, anthropologists, agronomists, political scientists, bureaucrats, pedagogues, philanthropists, and activists. And I saw 1,000 times how that superior gaze made collaboration and a complementarity between knowledges impossible. Other ways of relating and producing knowledge are totally possible, but they don't teach them in university or in the government ministry. Global ecological problems like hunger, the loss of agrobiodiversity, from 10,000 edible species, current diets only deal in about 150. Soil degradation, the slow death of the seas, the displacement of millions of people, victims of resource wars, and so on, requires more horizon, more commitment, and more risk than some academic degrees or the completion of a government audit obeying some arbitrary and decontextualized limits. To sum up, we could say that the logic of the expert makes it impossible to imagine this other culture that we must urgently create, and it makes it impossible to weave an ecology of reparations that we need to survive. On the other hand, also, to sum up, we could say that the logic of knowledge as a network, adaptive and not commodified, is the most important beacon to orient ourselves and make sure the future exists. What can we learn from this knowledge? For me, the greatest lesson is that quality is the most important and sustainable thing. A territory's criterion of quality gathers together the ethics of that territory's community, its notion of what is life, what is justice, what is abundance, and what is well-being. Says Adriana Cuena. Prison cells and death squads, the real first response to climate change. In April of 2009, representatives of the 28 member states of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, met in Strasbourg, France, and just across the border in Kehl, Germany. The largest military alliance on the planet had climate change on its agenda at a time when politicians in most member states were at best inactive and at worst actively denying the reality of the situation. What solution did they propose to climate change? Increasing border security, as well as biometric IDs and more surveillance for their domestic populations, and re-emphasizing their goal of normalizing the domestic use of military forces in urban environments by 2020. A strategy paper released in advance of the summit said plainly that, quote, security challenges are predominantly socioeconomic, not military technical in character, close quote. The paper goes on to make clear that socioeconomic threats are those posed by poor people, climate refugees, and others angered or harmed by the current state of affairs, and as such, member states should continue to integrate police and military action and be prepared to deploy the military in their home territories. Anyone who is shocked by this response or sees it as some kind of non sequitur has failed to appreciate the true nature or scope of the ecological crisis. World governments, particularly those in the global north, understand the crisis as a security issue. They know the problem is real, and they know growing deserts and rising sea levels will force hundreds of millions of people from their homes in search of their very survival. Their solution is to further militarize the borders, those borders of Fortress Europe and the American Southwest that are most definitely designed to kill, so that people fleeing for their lives will be dissuaded by the very real possibility of dying in their journey. To put it simply, the major militaries of the world, already among the greatest producers of toxic waste and greenhouse gases, propose killing even more people to shield themselves from the consequences of the crisis they are in large part responsible for. And they also propose increasing the repression against their own citizens, fully aware that the lower classes everywhere will bear the brunt of the crisis, and rebellions are to be expected in the north as well as in the south. While the rich and powerful rubbed shoulders at the summit, thousands of anarchists and other anti-capitalists took to the streets, battling with police and burning down banks as they tried to disrupt the NATO summit. Though the media condescendingly portrayed them as a mindless horde bent on evil deeds, they were perfectly aware of what NATO was proposing and the stakes for all the rest of us. Their response might be characterized as the most reasonable and intelligent, at the very least if we compare it to that of the scientists and NGOs who continue to dialogue with the same governments sponsoring the summit. Three kinds of people with the most experience and the most effectiveness at resisting the ecological crisis have been systematically excluded from the official conversation on solutions to climate change. Indigenous peoples trying to protect or recover their land and their traditional forms of life. People most affected by the ecological crisis, including climate refugees. And radical environmentalists, radical in the true sense of going to the root of the problem, and therefore typically participants in anti-capitalist and anti-colonial movements. These should not be thought of as three separate groups. Many indigenous people are anarchists and socialists. Many migrants or activists opposing incinerators or coal mines in their neighborhoods are indigenous or anti-capitalists or both. Instead, we can think of these as three different front lines that intersect on countless occasions. It is significant that the state treats people on all three of these lines as social enemies to be surveilled, as threats to be eliminated. NATO is not exceptional. From Borneo to Brighton, when people start taking action to defend the earth and fight for a dignified survival, the default response of governments and the economic interests they work with hand in hand is to resort to death squads or prison cells. On Borneo, one of the main threats to the environment, to indigenous communities, and to poor people stuck between small farming and an inhospitable economy and forced urbanization with unhealthy conditions is deforestation carried out primarily in connection with the palm oil, logging, and paper pulp industries, which constitute the main sources of revenue for the local oligarchy. Deforestation causes deadly air pollution, destroys soil, and spells an end to the small-scale farming many communities depend on. Those who resist face violence from police or paramilitary thugs working on behalf of the oligarchy. One activist from Borneo who works on agrarian issues and indigenous land struggles, particularly with several Dayak communities, told me how the state neutralizes resistance. He says, in the worst cases, the state murders its opponents. Though that happened more frequently during the New Order era, after a US-backed dictatorship murdered over 500,000 people, it still occurs today. The state also, quote, criminalizes and arrests Dayak activists or cultivators to cover up the actions of the palm oil companies. Sometimes arrested activists die in police custody, close quote. The activist described one case of a dissident journalist who was tortured and mutilated after writing critically of the business oligarchy that controls politics on the island. The journalist subsequently died in questionable circumstances. He says, I could name other cases of repression, but it's a bit psychologically exhausting. During the week that I was working on this section of the book, 2 indigenous land defenders were killed in Honduras. Jose Adan Medina and Felix Vasquez of the Tolupan and Lenca peoples, respectively, were assassinated for opposing hydroelectric dam construction and other land abuses. According to the NGO Global Witness, between 2002 and 2018, over 1,700 land defenders, people trying to stop the destruction of the environment or human rights abuses related to resource extraction, were murdered in 50 countries. Some 40% of the dead were indigenous, and the killers, the vast majority of whom committed their deeds with impunity, were police, military, and paramilitaries working at the direction of the state or of multinational companies. A record number of land defenders were murdered in 2019, with 212 deaths recorded and many more unrecorded. Colombia, the Philippines, and Brazil topped the list for murders, with the caveat that extractivist violence in many African countries is underreported, in part for reasons we will look at shortly. In Brazil, and especially in Colombia, paramilitary death squads created with the support of the United States attack communities that stand in the way of the large economic interests that destroy the rainforest to establish mines, logging operations, and plantations. In Colombia, Dole Food Company, Chiquita Brands International, and other companies paid paramilitaries several $1 million to protect their interests, including killing union organizers among their workers. The companies would pass the names of labor organizers, community activists, and suspected leftists to the paramilitaries, who would then execute them. Between 1997 and 2004, paramilitaries committed 4,335 homicides and 1,306 forced disappearances in communities near Chiquita plantations. And while it was on the Chiquita payroll, the AUC paramilitary group forcibly evicted 60,000 people from their homes in the banana-growing region of just one state. Even after the group was declared a terrorist organization by the U.S. State Department, a move that came only after decades of public pressure given U.S. government complicity with the paramilitaries, Chiquita was sending them money and smuggling in thousands of assault rifles for the AUC using the company's international distribution facilities. They were punished with a small fine after a 2007 legal action in which they were protected from serious consequences by attorney Eric Holder, whom President Obama would soon appoint as Attorney General. Throughout the Colombian Civil War that began in 1964, in large part due to the United States Cold War policies, 262,000 people have been killed, 82% of them civilians, and 120,000 are still missing. The lion's share of confirmed civilian killings were carried out by paramilitary death squads, 100,000, even though mainstream media, citing the same study I am, presented the news in a way that suggests leftist guerrillas were responsible for more killings, 35,000. The Colombian military, which received billions in aid, training, and weapons from the U.S., also had plenty of blood on its hands. Killing by the military became so systematic, officers began establishing quotas and offering cash rewards for higher body counts, leading to soldiers executing more than 10,000 civilians just between 2002 and 2010, largely homeless people or people with mental disabilities they had kidnapped or lured away from the cities. They falsely identified as leftist guerrillas in order to increase their kill counts and claim the rewards. In 1995, Ogoni writer and activist Ken Saro-Wiwa was executed by the Nigerian state together with 8 other activists who had been non-violently protesting the destruction of Ogoni lands in the Niger Delta by the oil industry, particularly Royal Dutch Shell. His last words were, "Lord, take my soul, but the struggle continues." He was right. In December 1998, a youth conference of the neighboring Ijaw people committed to a campaign of direct action against the oil industry, albeit nonviolently. The Nigerian military invaded the region with over 10,000 troops, and opened fire on a protest march with machine guns, killing at least 3. They again opened fire on a march demanding the release of those arrested, killing at least 3 more, and then invaded communities, terrorizing the people and raping women and girls. In January 1999, 100 soldiers directly attached to a Chevron facility attacked 2 Ijaw villages, killing and disappearing dozens. Despite this extreme level of violence, the Ijaw did not give up, and one might say they could not give up. The oil industry makes their lives impossible. Frequent leaks and explosions poison fields, destroy forests, rivers, and coastal waters, and kill workers and neighboring villagers. Since Dutch, British, and U.S. companies began oil extraction in 1956, they have leaked 1.5 million tons of oil into the land, or a current rate of 250,000 barrels every year. Increasingly, local Ijaw and Ogoni people cannot feed themselves from the fields, forests, and fisheries on which they had traditionally depended. This is a perfectly acceptable state of affairs within the sort of development framework favored by the World Bank and similar institutions. People should not feed themselves from the land. Subsistence agriculture is dismissed as a primitive activity. Rather, they should get jobs and then pay for food from industrialized and globalized producers, relying, of course, on oil to power their machinery, manufacture their chemicals, and transport their product. However, this is also not an option for the peoples of the Niger Delta, as all the profits of oil extraction go to foreign companies and the central government. The Ijaw took up arms to defend their lives and formed groups like the Movement for the Emancipation of the Niger Delta. MEND sabotaged oil facilities and kidnapped highly paid North American and European oil workers. Their actions and those of similar militant groups led to major reductions in Nigerian oil production, for example, shutting down 10% of production with a single attack in 2008, and leading to widespread reductions over the better part of a decade. The Nigerian military responded with bloody repression, including aerial bombardments of Ijaw communities. The U.S. military also stepped in to help the government better defend its oil platforms in the name of fighting piracy, helping oil production in the Niger Delta to grow again. The state-sanctioned murder of activists, using what the West deems to be legitimate, nonviolent tactics to defend their lands and their livelihoods, frequently drives their communities to take up arms just to survive. Subsequently, they often become more able to attack and stop the companies responsible for poisoning them. However, when they are then massacred by their governments with weapons from Europe and North America, human rights NGOs no longer count their deaths or those of the community members supporting them and giving them shelter in their lists of land defenders and environmental activists killed each year. So in fact, the above-cited figure of 1,700 murdered land defenders is woefully inadequate. The violence is by no means a phenomenon of the global South. It is the result of the colonial capitalist relations that transect the entire world. The profiteers and the shot callers can be found wherever there are major concentrations of political and economic power, from Brasilia to London. Contrary to the illusions of civility that are central to every democracy, the violence, while unequal, is also global. As the European Union promotes itself as a model for the green capitalist future, it also profits off the same gory repression. In the last few years, 7 Romanian park rangers have been murdered, and over 650 have been assaulted or threatened for going up against logging interests connected to an Austrian company. with the line between legal and illegal logging, quote, increasingly blurred. And environmental activists have been threatened or have had to go into hiding due to attempts on their lives after they investigated logging, hydroelectric dams, and other industries. Incidentally, these hydroelectric dams and these forests turned logging plantations are the ostensible carbon sinks and nature preserves that lie at the heart of the European Union's model for profitable environmental action. In North America and Europe, the government classifies people opposing pollution, deforestation, and global warming as, quote, extremists, and treats them accordingly. In the US, the FBI and Department of Homeland Security listed, quote, racial and environmentally themed ideologies, close quote, as primary motivators for domestic terrorist attacks. As for those racial ideologies, the FBI focused a great deal of attention on so-called Black identity extremists, its way of discrediting those who are outraged by racist police murders. The property damage of anti-racists and environmental activists merited such attention, while white supremacists were carrying out hundreds of attacks, many of them lethal, including full-scale massacres. Activists who carried out civil disobedience against oil pipelines, simply turning off valves, were placed on the same extremism lists as those responsible for mass shootings in Black churches. As Andrea Brock has documented, Europe is no stranger to the same dynamics. Those who set up encampments to defend forests are treated as enemies of society and met with militarized repression and marginalization by interlocking consortia of public and private security, elected officials, and corporate board members. As we shall see in the next chapter, farmers and anti-capitalists occupying the land and opposing the construction of an airport at Notre-Dame-des-Landes, France, were repeatedly attacked by a militarized police force, with one young person having their hand blown off by a flashbang grenade. German police defending the expansion of an expanding coal mine that is destroying the Hambach forest regularly brutalize protesters. Numbering in the thousands and backed by military-grade weaponry, they have cut protesters down from 6-meter-high tree sets, shot them with high-pressure water cannons in below-freezing temperatures, struck people with vehicles, attacked them with dogs, and kicked their teeth out. Italian police shot anarchist Carlo Giuliani in the head, killing him during heavy protests against the G8 in Genoa in 2001, where they also raided a protest convergence point, brutally assaulting and torturing dozens of people trapped there. At the G8 protests in Evian, France in 2003, police cut down an activist suspended from a bridge, causing him to fall 20 meters and almost killing him. In 2014, French police killed an environmental activist during heavy repression against a campaign to stop deforestation associated with a new dam. The campaign was eventually successful, and the dam canceled. At anti-capitalist and ecological protests across North America and Europe, police routinely attack protesters with less lethal weaponry, regardless of whether they are being peaceful or combative, occasionally causing deaths and more frequently leaving people permanently injured. Hundreds of people have had eyeballs shut out or suffered brain damage from high-impact munitions. At the protests against the free trade area of the Americas in Miami in 2003, a major neoliberal initiative that would have accelerated ecocidal practices across both continents, and which was defeated thanks in part to fierce opposition from the streets, police raped detainees. Sexual assault by police during arrest, especially against women, non-binary, and trans people, is common. To preserve the illusion of democracy and the beliefs of privileged citizenry that the institutions of power are on their side, police forces in the global north use a higher proportion of soft counterinsurgency techniques, but these come with their own forms of violence. Many participants in the George Floyd rebellion in 2020 associated counterinsurgency with discourses of reformism and nonviolence that facilitated the isolation of participants in the uprising, exposing them to the violence of the police, National Guard, and prison system, all of which could be naturalized if they were seen as being used against a criminal minority and not against the movement itself. This interplay illustrates how soft and hard counterinsurgency methods go hand in glove. Effective soft counterinsurgency requires massive intelligence gathering. Spying on politically active people in the northern democracies, even to an extent that violates the applicable laws, is systematic. This includes the long-term infiltration of anti-capitalist movements. In the UK, around 150 police agents went on deep infiltration assignments against anti-capitalist, environmental, and other left-wing movements since 1968, living under assumed identities and participating in those movements for several or even a dozen years. Agents routinely began romantic and sexual relationships with activists they were informing on, using the forms of manipulation they had been trained in. Several of these undercover cops impregnated activists, committed to forming a family with them, and when their stint was up, disappeared. Though the details that have become public are horrible, we should assume the truth is far worse. Police were caught destroying a large quantity of documents they had been ordered to preserve concerning the infiltration program since the 90s, when it expanded and shifted largely to environmental and anarchist groups. Since the scandal broke in the news, the UK has introduced a new law to officially allow domestic police to carry out illegal acts while undercover, with support from both major parties. Between 2010 and 2014, the Spanish state directed its substantial anti-terrorism apparatus against a new public enemy, anarchists, carrying out raids in a half-dozen cities, smashing down doors, waking people up with guns in the face, stealing all electronics, disappearing all cash, and hauling more than 50 people off to jail. In those years, anarchists had increasingly and effectively taken part in popular struggles against austerity measures, evictions, and deportations. They had also gotten the government's attention with animal liberation actions and campaigns against the MAT, a high-tension power line from France to Morocco, connecting energy markets and extending the distribution of nuclear, coal, and green energy. In the US, the use of anti-terrorism against ecological struggles can be traced back to the 90s, when the logging industry popularized the concept of eco-terrorism amidst the fight to save the redwoods. With massive resources, PR firms, and connections to the media, the logging industry tried to convince the public that those who broke laws and damaged inanimate property in defense of the earth were terrorists and a threat to society. Hollywood responded to the needs of industry with an enthusiastic entertainment/propaganda drive that undermines U.S. society's self-image of having a free media. Since the 90s, over 100 movies and TV shows have been cranked out to summon the specter of eco-terrorism, featuring bad guys who wanted to kill, cause mayhem, or destroy the entire human species for vague environmentalist motives. These works of industry propaganda span the spectrum from comedies to Michael Crichton thrillers, James Bond adventures to crime shows. On the contrary, Very few movies and shows feature people suffering from environmental racism, and even fewer show people breaking the law as an act of conscience or necessary resistance. Protagonists in environmentally themed movies are nearly always white lawyers, journalists, or citizen activists like the protagonists of Dark Waters and Aaron Brockovich. Industry lobbying paid off. In 2002, shortly after the attacks of September 11, 2001, and in the midst of the new war on terror, the U.S. government declared radical environmentalists to be the #1 domestic terrorism priority, at a time when lethal white supremacist attacks were already on the rise, and groups like Earth First, the Earth Liberation Front, ELF, and the Animal Liberation Front, ALF, were not even accused of having committed bodily harm. In the Green Scare, the U.S. government brought its full repressive weight against these movements. Jeff Free Luers and Craig Marshall were arrested in June 2000 for setting fire to 3 SUVs. Luers was given a 22-year prison sentence, later reduced to 10 years, only thanks to a well-organized support campaign. As part of Operation Backfire, in December 2005, the FBI indicted 13 alleged members of the ELF for dozens of arson and sabotage attacks against the Vail Ski Resort, power lines, genetic engineering research facilities, luxury housing developments, and other targets. They were threatened with hundreds of years in prison. One detainee, William Avalon Rogers, committed suicide shortly after arrest. Most non-cooperating defendants ended up with prison sentences of 6 to 7 years only because the FBI had to offer plea deals to avoid revealing what were probably illegal surveillance tactics should the case go to trial. In 2006, Eric McDavid and 2 others were arrested on conspiracy to bomb a dam as part of a plot that was funded, organized, and pushed ahead by a paid FBI informant who had become romantically involved with McDavid as part of her infiltration activities. Initially, McDavid was sentenced to 20 years in prison, but had his sentence reduced when the defense discovered that the FBI had withheld thousands of pages of evidence regarding the role of their informant. Also in 2006, 6 members of Stop Huntingdon Animal Cruelty, a group that coordinates aggressive boycott actions against Huntingdon Life Sciences, one of the largest animal testing companies in the world, were sentenced to 3 to 6 years in prison for sending large numbers of faxes to HLS, or, quote, internet stalking, close quote. They were convicted under the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, a law that allows the government to grant special punitive protections to companies that abuse and exploit animals. A year later, police in the UK, Netherlands, and Belgium coordinated a series of raids and arrested 32 people connected to SHAC. When HLS was on the verge of bankruptcy because the pressure campaign had effectively driven off other companies from doing business with them, the UK government stepped in to help the company secure financing. In 2009, Marius Mason was sentenced to 20 years in prison for an arson attack against a university lab involved in genetic engineering research funded by Monsanto, arson of logging trucks, and attacks against the construction of luxury homes. Like other Green Scare prisoners before him, Mason is being held in a communications management unit, an opaque corner of the federal prison system that uses extreme isolation and a prohibition on communication with the outside world as a form of psychological torture. CMUs are used almost exclusively against prisoners of the war on terror, anarchists, and radical environmentalists. This policy of treating land defenders as terrorists has not ended. At the end of 2020, 2 people in Washington state were given federal terrorism charges for blocking a rail line as part of a campaign against the construction of new gas pipelines. Corporate involvement in such repression also continues. It was recently revealed that agrochemical giant Monsanto runs an intelligence fusion center to compile information on and conduct disinformation and harassment campaigns against journalists and activists who threaten the company's financial interests through their research or organizing. Fusion Center is the same term the FBI uses for its counterterrorism centers. In just one example, Monsanto targeted a Reuters journalist investigating the carcinogenic effects of the company's star product, glyphosate, or Roundup. Their campaign included coordinating third parties to post negative reviews of the book, hiring scientists to cast doubt on the book's conclusions, pressuring the journalist's editors at Reuters, quote, very strongly every chance we get, close quote, in the hope, quote, she gets reassigned, covering up their financial relationship with scientists claiming their product was safe, accusing the journalist of being a, quote, pro-organic capitalist activist, as though there were big bucks to be made in opposing some of the world's largest chemical companies, and contracting search engine optimization, SEO experts, to make sure that their alternative facts, their negative reviews, and their various slanders of said journalist would appear in search engines above results showing how Roundup causes cancer. The above case illustrates how corporations can orchestrate subtle campaigns of censorship, often without revealing their hand. In 2020, an academic publisher abruptly canceled the publication of a book that showed how Canadian mining companies benefited from the genocide in Guatemala, moving in to stake their claims sometimes even before the death squads had left. The publishers expressed fears of lawsuits for defamation, though they refused to point out what part of the book, which received favorable peer reviews, might be considered defamation. And in Canada, the RCMP spied on the release event of a book against mining. The new media environment is also particularly hostile for people trying to defend the land. Facebook is largely responsible for the rapid growth in the extreme right around the world, encouraging racist conspiracy theories and climate denialism. Beyond the algorithms, when it comes time for administrators to block content, they rarely ban far-right groups, even after such groups carry out shootings and stabbings, but are very quick to block the anarchists and other anti-fascists who carry out the research and reporting necessary to protect our communities from neo-Nazis. When Facebook finally agreed to tamp down on misinformation related to climate change denial, they actually gave the boot to Indigenous and environmentalist pages that were fighting climate change. Direct police interventions also make the internet an unequal terrain for movements fighting for liberation. Articles I used in my research, particularly 2 texts by Indigenous anarchist Taweneke that I rely on extensively in Chapter 5, became unavailable after Dutch police raided and seized computer servers for several anti-capitalist news sites. For us, this is a common occurrence, almost completely erased from the mainstream, where right-wing pundits and transphobic authors, all of them millionaires with enormous platforms, control the debate around free speech and complain of being canceled. Even progressive media lend their support to policing operations against environmental movements. In a typical article, The Guardian accuses anarchists of trying to hijack a climate march, the classical maneuver of dividing the resistance into good protesters and bad protesters. What their outside agitator caricature leaves out is that anarchists have been a part of the struggle to save the planet since way before The Guardian began dedicating ink to hijacking the movement to favor institutional perspectives. The state deals with migrants with the same apparatus it brings to bear against social movements. Intelligence gathering, surveillance, demonization and scapegoating in the media, imprisonment, torture, targeted killings, and not least of which, depoliticization. Just as those fighting for clean water, a healthy relationship with the land, or a livable planet for future generations are deemed extremists, people who go through the trauma of leaving their homes behind are denied all reason and presented as criminals. The economies of the US, Canada, and the European Union depend on immigrant labor. As Harsha Walia documents, the purpose of the border regime is not to stop immigration, but to control and terrorize it. When Germany decided in 2015 to take in over 1 million refugees from the Syrian civil war, it was only because the largest association of German employers had just declared that the national economy faced a shortfall of millions of skilled laborers. But at no point did the German government allow direct flights from Turkey or Lebanon, where so many of the refugees are warehoused. Instead, they obligated refugees to make the expensive and perilous journey over the Aegean Sea, through the Balkans, under and over razor wire fences, through police truncheons and tear gas, past violent xenophobic crowds, so that finally they would arrive with almost nothing, willing to accept any labor conditions and bureaucratic controls. It was a journey that cost on average several thousand euros on top of the steep psychological price, effectively ensuring that primarily only members of the university-educated middle class would be able to make it. Migrants from Africa are made to cross the open sea on flimsy rafts, left in the water, or even deliberately rammed by the coast guards of the various Mediterranean states. Between 2014 and early 2020, over 20,000 have died in the crossing. Once across, hundreds of thousands of migrants are either held in detention centers, sometimes for years, or left to live in crowded shanty towns, often without access to running water, heating, toilets, or medical facilities, and at the mercy of arson attacks by fascists often connected to the police and operating with impunity from Spain to Greece. In the US, the border regime has been designed to force migrants to cross in the most dangerous regions of the Sonoran Desert. Between 1998 and 2019, Border Patrol recovered the bodies of 7,800 migrants who died while crossing. Many more have died on the Mexican side of the border or crossing through Guatemala and southern Mexico, where the Mexican government has increased enforcement in line with U.S. demands. Border Control, one of the branches of police with the strongest far-right sympathies, often brutalize and occasionally kill those who are crossing, as do right-wing militias. They also destroy caches of water left in the desert by volunteers trying to decrease the number of deaths. In detention, people are held in cells or cages with temperatures near freezing. People are left to die of medical neglect or denied attention in the case of pregnancies, leading to frequent miscarriages. Hundreds and possibly thousands have been involuntarily sterilized, leading some prisoners to compare the centers to, quote, an experimental concentration camp. Torture is systematic and inherent in the U.S. immigrant detention system, according to a new report, and many are brutalized and forced to sign their own deportation papers even though it means going back to a country where their lives are at risk. Australia is another terrible case of institutionalized racism that reveal borders to be an active measure of ongoing colonialism. The country legalized the buying and selling of enslaved Aboriginal laborers into the 1970s and had an immigration policy explicitly designed to only allow white immigrants, also lasting until the 1970s. In 2018, the government was forced to pass a new law outlawing slavery again after finally acknowledging the tens of thousands of Pacific Islanders working in the agricultural sector, getting paid only $10 a week after deductions by their employers. Determined to keep out unskilled immigrants from non-white countries, the Australian government obliges its poorer neighbors like Papua New Guinea to imprison asylum seekers indefinitely in facilities that have been compared to concentration camps. Meanwhile, solidarity with migrants is being increasingly criminalized. While humanitarian aid constitutes one of the mechanisms by which migrants are surveilled, controlled, and maintained in abject precarity and poverty, direct action and solidarity has helped migrants win housing and gain resources on their own terms, or pass clandestinely through strict border regimes. In Europe, people are increasingly being legally required to report on undocumented people and prohibited from giving them food or water. Squats and autonomous spaces created for and by migrants are targeted for eviction. Autonomous transportation infrastructure that provides mobility to undocumented people is criminalized and shut down, and those aiding migrants have been charged with trafficking, which carries a sentence of up to 10 years imprisonment. Ironically, European governments and their private partners, who cynically paint migrants and border activists as traffickers, have funneled millions of euros to the Libyan militias that actually control both the imprisonment and the trafficking of refugees at a key point on the southern Mediterranean coast. In the US, people can be imprisoned for years for giving migrants a map or giving them a ride to the hospital, and Border Patrol has increasingly been raiding a first aid camp set up by volunteer group No More Deaths. Migrants who speak out about abuses frequently get targeted with speedy deportations. In July 2019, as the Trump administration was gearing up to carry out major raids targeting undocumented people across the country, anarchist Willem van Spronsen set fire to an ICE vehicle at the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma, Washington. His action and other widespread acts of resistance succeeded in getting ICE to dramatically scale back the raids, but it came with a heavy price. Police discovered him in the parking lot lighting the fire, and they took advantage of the situation and executed him on the spot, similar to how federal marshals would execute Michael Reinhold in September 2020 in retaliation to Reinhold killing a white supremacist who was threatening black counter-protesters at a rally in Portland several days earlier. Though the border regime is designed to brutalize racialized people and uphold the privileges of whiteness, these killings show that whiteness is less a question of skin color and more a question of alliances. Those who fight against the alliances represented by white supremacy and colonialism may face the very apparatus of annihilation designed to control racialized people. Another major target of repression in the global north are indigenous communities, especially those resisting the profitable processes of ecocide that the reservation system was designed to enable. When water protectors tried to prevent the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline transporting shale oil through Lakota territory, local, state, and federal police mobilized a huge militarized force complemented by the private security firm Tiger Swan, complete with helicopters, drones, tanks, infiltration, and surveillance, constituting, quote, the largest mobilization of cops and military in the state's history since 1890, when the military was deployed to crush the horseless and starving ghost dancers at Standing Rock, close quote. Tiger Swan agents coming out of counterinsurgency operations in Iraq and Afghanistan called indigenous water protectors terrorists engaging in a, quote, jihadist insurgency, close quote. Private and public police forces carried out brutal raids, beat, shot, and gassed water protectors, and soaked them with powerful water cannons in sub-zero temperatures miles from any facility where they might receive adequate care for hypothermia. They used attack dogs, rubber bullets, concussion grenades, tear gas, and sound cannons. No one was killed in any of the multiple acts of police repression, only thanks to good luck and well-organized medical support. However, a native woman lost her sight after being shot in the face with a tear gas grenade at close range, and a solidarity protester had her arm partially blown off by a concussion grenade. Many others received traumatic head wounds from police projectiles. In one single attack on November 20, 2016, 200 people were injured. Multiple people were imprisoned with the aid of police infiltrators. Throughout the resistance, over 830 people were arrested and given state charges, while 5 people, all of them indigenous, were given federal charges. One indigenous and Chicano protester, Steve Martinez, is locked up at the time of this writing for refusing to testify before a grand jury. He could be kept in jail for up to 18 months to force him to give information against other people in the movement. It has been pointed out time and again that when far-right groups carry out armed occupations, even when they shoot and murder political opponents in the course of white riots, the police stand back and let it happen. Often they participate directly. Subsequently, prosecutors are always more lax in bringing charges. This is not, however, a plea for fairness from the judicial system or for more arrests of fascists. Rather, it is evidence that the fascists in the street, extractivist profiteers in corporate boardrooms, and the criminal justice system are all facets of a white supremacist colonial system that is destroying the planet. Because repression transcends formal exercises of state power, we should also consider the connection between pipeline construction, shale oil extraction, and man camps, the itinerant labor camps of often highly paid, mostly white male workers associated with increasing rates of drug and alcohol usage and violence against indigenous women and Two-Spirit people. Going back to mining incursions in the Black Hills Gold Rush at the end of the 19th century, or the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers damming rivers in Lakota Territory in the middle of the 20th, settler profiteering has always been connected to violence against indigenous communities, whether or not the perpetrators wear a uniform. What happened at Standing Rock is not exceptional. It is fully in line with the U.S. government's repressive practices against indigenous resistance. In the early 70s, the American Indian movement aided traditionals on the Pine Ridge Oglala Lakota Reservation, not far from Standing Rock, to regain their sovereignty and expose the corrupt tribal government that was closely connected to Washington and to regional business interests. For example, turning reservation grazing lands over to white ranchers. The BIA and FBI helped the tribal government stay in power, in part by financing a heavily armed paramilitary force. In the years that culminated in the 1973 Wounded Knee standoff, FBI agents, police, paramilitaries, and unknown assailants killed over 60 Oglala traditionals, AIM members, and sympathizers. Long-term prisoner Leonard Peltier is still locked up as a result of that repression. In Canada, Progressive Prime Minister Justin Trudeau came into office on pledges of taking climate action and improving relations with the dozens of Indigenous nations whose stolen lands the Canadian state is built on. In fact, Trudeau took advantage of his conservative predecessor having left the Kyoto Accords to go all in for the exploitation of the Athabasca tar sands, a huge deposit of extremely dirty oil that takes an enormous amount of energy to extract and process, leaving an immense expanse of the Canadian interior denuded of all forests and topsoil in the process. To capitalize on the oil boom, Trudeau's government sank billions of dollars into new pipeline construction despite fierce Indigenous resistance across the continent. When the Wet'suwet'en Nation effectively blocked the construction of the Coastal GasLink pipeline on their own lands, the RCMP, Canada's federal police, created initially as a paramilitary force against First Nations, carried out several militarized raids on Wet'suwet'en encampments, and were given permission to shoot to kill. In their raids, the RCMP used boats, helicopters, drones, and intensive physical and social media surveillance of land defenders, in addition to large numbers of agents with armored vehicles and military-grade weaponry. They also considered the use of social services to take custody of any children arrested, fully in line with Canada's long and violent history of using so-called residential schools targeting Indigenous children as a tool for genocide. Canada's 2015 Anti-Terrorism Act, quote, sanctions the criminalization of Indigenous environmentalists by enhancing surveillance and legal powers against any potential interference with Canada's critical infrastructure or territorial integrity, while RCMP surveillance documents identify land defenders as Aboriginal extremists, close quote. Again, recent Canadian history shows this is far from exceptional. In 1995, 20 First Nations covered a part of the unceded Secwepemc territory at Tsepetin, an important Sundance site. In response, the Canadian government sent in 400 police and military with helicopters and armored personnel carriers who fired 77,000 rounds at the warriors. These are just a few examples. It would take more than a single book to document all the incidents of police and military repression against Indigenous peoples in Australia, Canada, the United States, and other settler states. Powerful governments not aligned with NATO are no better when it comes to repression. In Russia, anarchists met with some successes protecting the Khimki forest from highway construction in 2010. In response, police arrested anyone they could find associated with the protests and looked the other way as armed thugs attacked encampments set up in the forest to halt logging. As repression mounted, dozens of anarchists and anti-fascists fled the country, seeking asylum in Europe. The government turned towards preemptive repression. In 2017 and 2018, in advance of contested elections and the FIFA World Cup, 9 anarchists were arrested in the Network case and sentenced to between 6 and 18 years in prison. They were tortured into signing confessions, including being hung upside down and beaten, or being shocked with electric currents until their teeth broke. Western media that usually enjoyed publicizing Russian human rights abuses were largely silent on the case. China has been the site of a growing number of, quote, mass incidents, close quote, or riots, many of them against development projects, pollution, unsafe working conditions, and corruption between party bosses and the new industrialists. A staggering 65% of the 180,000 annual mass incidents are rural conflicts triggered by land grabs, with government officials and private developers forcibly requisitioning village lands, sometimes without even offering compensation. Communication between these different sites of resistance has become increasingly difficult over the last 10 years as the Chinese government consolidates its control over the internet. Signs of the underlying tension still boil over despite the censorship, as when a dispossessed villager killed 4 with a homemade bomb at a government office near Guangzhou this past March, amidst a conflict with farmers being dispossessed with little or no compensation for a major development project. The changing balance of power also means the overturning of earlier environmental victories, such as the defeat of a planned hydroelectric dam on the Yangtze River at Tiger Leaping Gorge. The dam, which would have displaced 100,000 people, was halted by locals in 2006, but now the government is resurrecting plans for the dam, reflecting a new balance of power, as well as the opportunities that green energy and carbon neutral policies afford governments for neutralizing environmental movements. In another example of the same dynamic, 3 conservationists in the Ningxia Hui Autonomous Region were arrested and accused of extortion, making threats and, quote, provoking trouble, close quote, in September 2020, after filing whistleblower complaints regarding pollution from a paper mill and destruction of protected gazelle habitat for the construction of wind farms. Both China and Cuba helped the U.S. arrest Green Scare fugitives who were on the run. Furthermore, Chinese companies are fully invested in the fossil fuel industry and the destruction of indigenous lands across the world, from tar sands extraction in Alberta to iron mining at sacred sites in Australia. Green Scare prisoner Joseph Dibby, currently awaiting trial, wrote, "The cataclysm that is unfolding today can be laid at the doorstep of the law enforcement agencies that have paved the way for it by making it so difficult for ordinary people to defend themselves against ecological devastation. If we don't stop them, they will frog march us directly into the apocalypse, profiting all the way. And when the last well is poisoned and the last forest burns up, they will be the last to die." A focus on law enforcement and repression more broadly enables us to understand the ecological crisis in a new light. We don't need the rich and powerful to save us from the destruction of the planet. In fact, we are the ones who are saving the planet every day. What we really need is for them to get the hell out of the way. But they won't do that. In fact, they will systematically silence, marginalize, imprison, brutalize, torture, and kill those who are most affected by the ecological crisis, those who have the most collective experience and the best ideas for how to save the planet. In this light, there is little difference between a coal mine and a wind farm or a hydroelectric dam. The affinity of green capitalism for the very same death squads, torture techniques, anti-terrorism operations, and smear campaigns should belie the pretensions that so-called renewable energy or sustainable commerce is an improvement. The involuntary authoritarian character of fossil fuel capitalism and green capitalism is impossible to ignore once you start looking. In December 2011, global private security firm Stratfor was hacked. Stratfor maintains high-level relations with intelligence, political, and military officials from the U.S. to Israel and provides consulting and intelligence services to private companies and governments around the world to aid in public relations, counterinsurgency, disruption, and regime change efforts. They have described themselves as a shadow CIA. The resulting data dumps revealed widespread surveillance and illegal actions by government and private entities. We only have access to this information thanks to the hack carried out by Anonymous. The anarchist hacker Jeremy Hammond was sentenced to 10 years in prison for the action. Similarly, we only know about the FBI's bloody COINTELPRO program, which resulted in the aforementioned lethal campaign against AIM, as well as the assassination of Fred Hampton and several other Black Panthers, because a group of revolutionaries broke into the FBI field office and stole the documents. In other words, the only way we ever know what our governments are actually doing is thanks to illegal direct action, leaving any discussion of government accountability rather hollow. In the Stratfor leaks, we learned how governments view social movements and how they try to neutralize us. What is important to emphasize is that Stratfor, like governments all over the world, use the lens of counterinsurgency when dealing with the dissent of their subjects. With one exception, they do not make a distinction between the middle-class high school student going on strike on Fridays to raise awareness about climate change, the journalist researching the cancerous effects of widely used pesticides, the anarchist setting fire to construction equipment to save a forest from being bulldozed, and a native elder leading a ceremony in an encampment seeking to regain treaty lands from a settler state. They view all these people as enemies. The only distinction they make is how to turn different kinds of dissidents against one another in order to buy out some and marginalize the rest. Remember that at the heart of counterinsurgency is the belief that all of a government's subjects are potential enemies. According to a framework used by Stratfor and other security consultants, there are 4 types of dissidents and a 3-step method to neutralizing them. There are the radicals who, quote, want to change the system, have underlying socio-political motives, and see multinational corporations as inherently evil, close quote. These organizations, writes Ronald Duchin, do not trust the federal, state, and local governments to protect them and to safeguard the environment. They believe rather that individuals and local groups should have direct power over industry. I would categorize their principal aims as social justice and political empowerment. There are the idealists who, quote, want a perfect world, close quote. But because of their, quote, intrinsic altruism, close quote, can be made to sympathize with the interests of industry and shy away from conflictive positions. There are opportunists who will seize, quote, the opportunity to side with the powerful for career gain, close quote. And there are the realists who are, quote, willing to work with the system, close quote, and are, quote, pragmatic. The realist should always receive the highest priority in any strategy dealing with a public policy issue, close quote. The 3 steps are rather simple. Duchin goes on to write, first, isolate the radicals. Second, cultivate the idealists and educate them into becoming realists. And finally, co-opt the realists into agreeing with industry. If your industry can successfully bring about these relationships, and opportunists can be counted on to share in the final policy solution. It is more than a little ironic that those who consider themselves realists are considered the easiest to manipulate. This is why it is neither sectarianism nor an excess of zeal when we declare that NGOs and humanitarian activists are part of the state's counterinsurgency campaign. We can see this when we look back at resistance to the oil industry in Nigeria. When Ken Saro-Wiwa was led up to a scaffold and executed, his death was counted. He was a poet and a nonviolent protest leader after all. But what happened to his peers who learned the lesson, who valued their own lives, who took up arms or gave shelter to those who did, and who actually hurt the profits and cut off the production of the oil industry? When they were murdered by British or US munitions fired from helicopters dispatched by the Nigerian government or Shell Oil, those very well-meaning NGOs did not include them in their list of murdered land defenders. Their lives are neither counted nor valued. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. To those with blood on their hands, counterinsurgency revolves around separating the resistance into good actors and bad actors, negotiating with or buying off the good actors so that the bad actors can be isolated, imprisoned, or massacred. Not so many people would trust Stratfor, Shell Oil, or the US military's Africa Command telling us that Ijaw and Ogoni people fighting for their homelands are evil terrorists who deserve to be shot down. It is the very NGOs who evince a concern for human rights that are crucial to this counterinsurgency operation, celebrating the activists who use tactics deemed legitimate by the government. By not celebrating every bit as vociferously the lives and the resistance of those who make the hard choice to resist with illegal and revolutionary methods, these NGOs are signaling who is legitimate and who is subhuman. They are creating the division between good actors and bad actors that the militaries, death squads, and counterinsurgency experts rely on. And they are doing so in a way that most people who think they care about the environment or human rights will find credible. Likewise, they are signaling to the rest of society what kinds of tactics, legal, peaceful, less effective, will be honored, and what kinds of tactics, illegal, transformative, are associated with dangerous, frightening elements who seem to inevitably, in the moral arc of capitalism's universe, end up in unmarked graves. These NGOs also reject the learning process that happens in communities that, through direct experience, turn from methods that revolve around petitioning, protest, and lawsuit to methods that revolve around occupation, sabotage, and directly creating the changes they need. As long as social movements have memory, they have access to a vast store of collective intelligence, and this intelligence favors self-defense and direct action because such methods are more effective. By rejecting such methods, the NGOs place themselves above the communities in struggle, claiming to know best how to achieve change. This is nothing other than a continuation of colonial dynamics. In order to outmaneuver these counterinsurgency strategies, we need to start by becoming aware of them. There can be no effective struggle for healthy lives on a healthy planet unless we are aware of the systematic repression leveled against those who seek this most basic goal and stand in solidarity with those who are most affected. Because when we support one another and fight back, we can win.